Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is something you were never meant to hear. Behind the portraits of regal smiles, behind the velvet curtains of royal halls, there was once a union so dark it poisoned an entire empire. A king and a queen, two thrones locked together not by love, not by loyalty, but by something far more sinister, a covenant of blood and control. They were not partners in the way you imagine marriage, but conspirators in a pact that stretched across generations, one that reshaped history in ways the official records could never admit. Their story begins not with their coronation, but with a whisper in the dark, a secret ceremony carried out in a candlelit chamber, witnessed only by priests whose tongues were bound to silence. Those priests knew this couple's power wasn't merely political. It was ritualistic, metaphysical, and rooted in something that made even seasoned monarchs shiver. This was not love. This was an alignment of forces. And while the world adored them as a golden pair, the empire they ruled would come to realize that their union carried with it a curse. Every child born of their bloodline was fated to inherit the same chain of manipulation. Every subject beneath their crown unknowingly served the very system that fed upon their obedience. Tonight I'm going to pull you into their world. A world where affection was a mask, where devotion was a prison, and where two thrones sat side by side, but only one will was permitted to exist. And as we descend together, I warn you, once you see what truly lay between them, you will never see power, love, or loyalty the same way again. Imagine standing in a hall of mirrors, each reflection showing you something slightly different. A smile that doesn't quite match your own, an eye that lingers too long. That is the illusion this royal couple perfected. To their subjects, they were a vision of balance. The king, strong and decisive. The queen, graceful and wise. But behind the mirrored glass, the truth was fractured. She was not his complement, she was his controller. She understood the deepest code of manipulation, that real power is not taken by the sword, but by shaping the thoughts of the one who wields it. And so she didn't fight him, she rewired him. The king's decrees, his laws, even his wars bore the queen's fingerprints, though no one dared accuse her. But it went deeper than politics. She whispered doubts into his ear at night, questions that chipped away at his certainty until his own thoughts no longer belonged to him. He believed he was making decisions. In truth, he was executing hers. And yet, here is where the shadow thickens. She was not free either. For even she was bound by a covenant older than their marriage, a secret council of advisors who had guided royal unions for centuries, ensuring no throne ever belonged solely to the crowned. The marriage was not their choice. It was engineered. And every intimate exchange, every gesture of devotion, every royal child conceived was part of a design so elaborate it made love itself feel like an illusion. To the outside world this was romance. But behind the veil, it was nothing less than a theater of control, choreographed for the obedience of the masses. But where did this covenant come from? To answer that, you must leave the palace walls and step into the crypt beneath it, a place where few have dared to linger. Beneath the marble floors of the throne room lay a hidden chamber carved centuries before their reign, etched with symbols that predate their religion, their nation, even their dynasty. This was the womb of their power. According to suppressed chronicles, every royal union had to descend here before the crown was placed upon their heads. It was not a coronation, it was an initiation. Witnesses described how the couple stood before an altar of stone, their hands cut open, blood mingled, their vows not to each other, but to something far older. Some called it an ancestral spirit, others a pact with the council unseen. But the effect was undeniable. Every ruler who entered this chamber left with eyes that no longer belonged entirely to them. Their vision carried a shadow. Their voices a strange weight. They were not merely rulers anymore, they were conduits. And this particular couple, bound in that crypt, were said to have embraced the covenant more fully than any before them. The queen's smile became sharper, the king's temper colder. From that moment, the empire's destiny was no longer written in ink or law. It was carved into the very souls of its rulers. And the people above, oblivious, cheered for their sovereigns, never knowing they had become subjects not to a monarchy, but to something far darker. Of course, history tried to erase these details. Court scribes describe the couple as blessed by heaven, their union as the fulfillment of prophecy. But prophecy is a convenient word for control. What if I told you that every prophecy whispered into their court had been engineered? That ancient manuscripts were not discovered, but forged? This is the kind of deception that lasts centuries because no one thinks to question the source. The queen, wise in her manipulations, would arrange visions to be reported by monks, visions conveniently aligning with her own political agenda. The king, already softened by her psychological grip, took these visions as divine affirmation. Imagine how impossible it was for the people to resist. Every law, every war, every tax was not just the will of the monarchs, it was God's will. To disobey was to sin. And in that moment, loyalty was no longer political, it was spiritual. A nation chained by belief. Here lies the brilliance of their bond. They understood that the sword could silence a man, but belief could silence generations. Their marriage became the perfect emblem of this. Two figures so radiant in public, yet dripping with shadows in private. And as the empire grew under their rule, so did the silence of the people. For the deeper the lie, the more sacred it appeared. And when a lie becomes sacred, who dares to challenge it? But let me take you further, deeper, into the forbidden. There are records, hidden away in monastic libraries, that hint the queen was not simply ambitious. She was trained. From childhood, she had been groomed for this role by a society of women known only as the keepers. Their doctrine was never spoken aloud, only passed in secret writings coded into embroidery, prayers, even lullabies. The keepers believed that the true throne was not the chair of the king, but the mind of the king. To control him was to control the world. And so, when she was chosen as the royal bride, she was not stepping into love, she was stepping into her mission. Every smile she gave him was calculated. Every word a seed. And when their people praised her as the embodiment of grace, they were unknowingly praising the precision of her training. But here lies the chilling twist. Even the queen, manipulator though she was, remained a pawn of a higher design. The keepers answered to another force, one even older, one even more hidden. Their teachings were not born from their own wisdom, but from fragments of forbidden texts said to be salvaged from a fallen empire before their own. A cycle of manipulation, centuries long, endlessly repeating under new names and new thrones. And so this marriage, this royal bond, was not unique. It was another performance in a theater that had been playing long before any of us were born. Yet this particular act would be remembered because of the devastation it unleashed. For when two thrones join under one shadow, the empire does not stand stronger. It begins to decay from within. The deeper you look, the more you realize this was not just a marriage but an experiment. Imagine a laboratory of human willpower where the subjects never knew they were being tested. That was the empire under this couple. Every decree was not just about governing, it was a psychological maneuver. When they raised taxes, it was not to fund wars alone, but to study how much suffering a population could endure before they broke. When they declared war, it was not only to expand territory but to measure how far blind loyalty could drive men into slaughter. And every festival, every public display of affection between the king and queen, was a calculated ritual, reinforcing in the people's subconscious the image of perfect unity, so no one dared to imagine division. But here's the dark brilliance. They never gave the people a villain. Both king and queen presented themselves as saviors, protectors, chosen ones. And when a population cannot find a villain outside, they turn their suspicion inward. People began to doubt themselves, to police one another, to suspect their neighbors. In doing so, the couple never had to wield the whip. The people whipped themselves. This was not governance. It was psychological conditioning on a scale so vast it made rebellion nearly impossible. For how do you rebel when you can no longer trust even your own thoughts? But cracks began to appear. Whispers in the palace kitchens, rumors in the market stalls. Servants swore they saw the queen praying not to God, but to something else, kneeling before mirrors, whispering words backwards, leaving drops of blood where no one dared to question. The king himself began to show signs of fracture. Some nights he would wander the corridors, muttering to unseen presences, his eyes hollow, his words incoherent. And yet by morning he was regal again, composed, untouchable. These were not the symptoms of madness, but of possession. His soul had been split between himself and something older, something carried into him during the ritual beneath the palace. The people never saw this side, of course. But the servants did, and their whispers spread like cracks through marble. Soon entire villages began to speculate. Had the royal couple sold themselves? Were they still human or something more? And though no one dared to say it aloud in the presence of authority, the rumor took root. Their love was not human love at all. It was a bond crafted in shadows, designed not to nurture, but to consume. And the more people felt the weight of invisible chains tightening around their daily lives, the more they began to believe the whispers might be true. You must understand, this empire thrived not only on obedience but on silence. Breaking that silence was the first act of rebellion. And so the truth began to surface through coded songs sung by children, through stories whispered at firelight, through graffiti carved into the backs of tavern benches. One phrase appeared again and again: 2 thrones, 1 shadow. It was a warning. And with it, a realization spread. The people were not ruled by 2 sovereigns but by one sinister will. But here's the part that chills me. The phrase itself seemed to have power. The moment people spoke it, they began to see things differently. They noticed how every sermon from the church echoed royal decrees word for word. They noticed how every law, no matter how unrelated, funneled wealth back into the palace. They noticed how fear had been woven into every tradition. Fear of sin, fear of punishment, fear of questioning. It was as if the phrase had unlocked their vision, like scales falling from their eyes. And so the couple's greatest weapon, illusion, began to erode. Yet illusion, when threatened, does not crumble quietly. It fights back. And the royal couple, sensing the unraveling, prepared a spectacle so grand, so terrifying, that it would silence doubt for another generation. That spectacle came in the form of what history books politely call the Great Purification. A festival, they said. A unifying moment, they claimed. But beneath the banners and music, it was nothing less than a purge. Thousands were summoned to the capital to swear loyalty before the thrones. Those who hesitated, just for a breath, were dragged away. Some were never seen again. Others returned hollow, speaking in strange tones, their eyes devoid of life. The king gave speeches drenched in righteousness, while the queen watched, her gaze unblinking, her lips curled into the faintest smile. What most didn't realize was that this was not merely political theater, it was ritual. The purge was blood sacrifice masked as governance. And here is the most haunting detail. The royal couple sat not side by side during the ceremony, but slightly apart, creating a triangle with the altar placed between them. Every drop of blood spilled that day was funneled into the covenant that bound them. The crowd cheered, believing they had witnessed loyalty rewarded and treachery punished. In truth, they had witnessed the feeding of a throne that was never meant to protect them, but to consume them. From that day forward, fear was no longer whispered in markets or kitchens. It was etched into the very soul of the empire. Yet even in the darkest reign, a seed of resistance survives. Among the scribes, those tasked with recording only what the crown permitted, one dared to write the truth. His manuscript, hidden inside the lining of a prayer book, spoke of the covenant beneath the palace, of the queen's shadowed rituals, of the king's hollow eyes. He wrote not for his generation, but for those yet to come, believing that knowledge itself was rebellion. And here is where I turn to you, the listener, the seeker, the one who has followed me this far down the spiral. You must understand that hearing this story is not entertainment, it is initiation. Because once knowledge enters you, you cannot return to ignorance. The seed has been planted in you as it was planted in those who whispered, 2 thrones, 1 shadow. So I ask you now to anchor this moment in your own mind. Go to the comments and write the phrase 2 thrones, 1 shadow. Write it twice. Not for the algorithm, though it helps, but for yourself. To mark the moment you stepped into the circle of awareness. Because after this, the descent only grows darker. And once you see the next layers, you will never again believe that power and love, crown and devotion, are what they appear to be. The great deception of this royal union was not just in their politics, but in how they rewrote the very idea of family itself. To the people, they presented themselves as parents of the nation. Every portrait, every sculpture, every coin minted bore the image of their joined hands, their gazes fixed not on each other but outward, toward the masses. This was no accident. It was a deliberate inversion of truth. They wanted the people to feel like children, small and dependent, forever seeking guidance from their parents. And what do children do when parents demand obedience? They comply. Even when it hurts. Even when it makes no sense. The empire was infantilized, stripped of its maturity, its independence, its strength. Citizens became perpetual children, incapable of imagining life outside their rulers. And in this infantilization lay the most sinister trap. The people began to love their chains. They begged for punishment, for correction, for reassurance that the king and queen knew best. This was not governance, it was psychological enslavement, generational and self-sustaining. And so long as the people believed in their royal parents, they would never see themselves as sovereign beings, capable of breaking free. But inside the palace walls, the reality was far more twisted. The royal couple's own children did not grow up in love, but in fear. Diaries hidden away, later discovered in fragments, describe how the queen rarely touched her children, except during ritual ceremonies. She viewed them not as sons and daughters but as vessels, extensions of the covenant, tools to be sharpened and used. The king, though more affectionate, was no safer. His love was unstable, shifting between warmth and sudden bursts of cold rage, as if he himself no longer controlled his own hands. Imagine growing up in such a house, where a mother's kiss was a calculation, and a father's embrace could turn into violence without warning. These children were raised not to rule but to perpetuate. They were never allowed to imagine futures beyond the throne. And when one child, a daughter, dared to dream of escaping, the punishment was swift. She was locked away, erased from official records, her name forbidden to be spoken aloud. Yet whispers of her survived in the villages. A princess who saw through the illusion, who wanted freedom, and who paid the price for trying to take it. She became a phantom legend, a warning of what happened when even royal blood resisted the covenant. Now, what I'm about to tell you next is dangerous knowledge. Beneath the surface of the queen's rituals lay a forbidden teaching, one so well hidden that even most of her advisors never knew it. She practiced what was called the inversion of mirrors. It was a doctrine that taught her how to turn every accusation, every suspicion, every weakness into a weapon of control. If someone accused her of manipulation, she accused them of betrayal. If someone doubted her visions, she claimed they doubted God. If someone revealed her cruelty, she cloaked it in the language of necessity. The inversion was flawless, because it was not merely strategy but psychological sorcery. It rewired the minds of those around her, leaving them doubting themselves, questioning their sanity, until they surrendered to her version of reality. And what's more chilling is that she didn't just use this power on her enemies. She used it on the king himself. Every outburst of his, every flicker of suspicion, was turned back against him, until he lived in permanent doubt. Imagine being the most powerful man in the empire, yet unable to trust your own mind. That was the king's prison. And in that prison the queen reigned supreme. But remember, control is never perfect. And the cracks widened further when a plague swept through the empire. People began to question why their divine rulers, supposedly blessed, could not protect them from death itself. Entire villages fell silent, families vanished, and fear grew too heavy for illusion to contain. This was the moment the queen dreaded. Because when people suffer without reason, they begin to look for hidden causes. They start asking questions that were forbidden. Why did the royal couple never fall ill? Why did their closest advisors seem untouched while thousands rotted in the streets? And here, my friend, is where suppressed accounts tell us something chilling. The plague was no accident. It was a weapon. Records uncovered centuries later suggest that the sickness was deliberately unleashed upon the empire's poorest districts, while antidotes were quietly administered to the wealthy and the court. The purge of disease was no less intentional than the purge of the sword. It culled the weak, stripped the people of willpower, and reinforced the belief that survival itself depended on proximity to the throne. But those who saw through it, those who dared to whisper the truth, were silenced with finality. Their corpses piled high in mass graves, their names erased as if they had never lived at all. And yet, the truth has a way of surviving. Buried in coded psalms, hidden in embroidery, carved into hidden beams of village churches, the people passed down fragments of resistance. They sang songs that sounded like prayers but were warnings in disguise. They told children bedtime stories of kingdoms where rulers were liars, planting seeds of doubt under the cloak of innocence. One phrase endured above all: the thrones feed, but they do not bleed. That was their way of saying the rulers consumed the lifeblood of the people, but never suffered with them. This phrase traveled, muttered by peasants, repeated by merchants, etched into the margins of holy texts. It became a quiet rebellion of thought. And the queen, sensing the danger of ideas, launched her most ruthless campaign yet. She decreed that all stories, all songs, all prayers must pass through royal censors before being spoken aloud. Imagine that, every word monitored, every phrase controlled, every act of language weaponized. But it was too late. Once an idea takes root, it cannot be killed. The phrase lived on in whispers, like embers waiting for breath. And as those embers spread, the empire's illusion weakened further. The couple's power still held, but now it trembled on a knife's edge. For the people had begun to awaken. The queen understood that rebellion does not begin with swords, it begins with whispers. And whispers were rising like smoke across the empire. So she turned outward. What most people never realized was that her influence stretched far beyond her own borders. Through secret correspondence, she wove a web of alliances with rulers of neighboring kingdoms, not by treaties but by seduction of thought. She offered them fragments of her doctrine, the art of the inversion of mirrors, teaching them how to control their people without resistance. In return, she demanded silence and allegiance. One by one, thrones beyond her own began to bend, not in public but in secret. The empire was no longer just a kingdom, it was becoming the heart of a hidden federation, all bound by the same covenant. And here lies the sinister twist: the king had no knowledge of this network. He believed his reign extended only to his borders. In truth, his wife was binding the entire region under her shadow, forging a hidden empire of thought and manipulation. And though history remembers her as loyal consort, in reality she was architect of a dominion far greater than any single throne. A dominion that lived in silence, unseen, yet unshakably real. But the deeper her web spread, the more fragile the bond with her husband became. The king, hollowed by years of psychological enslavement, began to stir with fragments of resistance. Diaries recovered centuries later reveal entries in which he questioned whether his thoughts were his own. "When I speak, I hear her voice," he wrote. "When I sleep, I dream her dreams. Where am I? Where did I go?" These words were never meant to be read, but they show us a man no longer whole, a king beginning to see the bars of his cage. And when he began to notice that foreign rulers bent strangely toward his queen's counsel, suspicion grew. His questions became sharper, more dangerous. He asked her outright, "Who do you serve?" But the queen, master of inversion, answered with another question, "Who do you serve, my king?" The doubt tore at him. Was he the betrayer? Or was she? This is how manipulation works. It makes the victim question their own mind more than the manipulator's hand. But the seed was planted, and seeds always grow. The king began to quietly seek answers. And the answers he found would shake not only his throne, but the very covenant that bound them. What he uncovered was nothing less than betrayal. Through secret agents, the king discovered letters hidden in the queen's private chamber. Letters written in her own hand, not to him, but to other monarchs, promising them protection under her shadow. His rage was volcanic, but he did not strike immediately. For the first time, he understood that open confrontation with her would be suicide. She was too clever, too prepared, too beloved by the people. So he played her game. He feigned ignorance, pretended to be weak, and let her believe he was still her puppet. But behind the mask, he began gathering allies, men and women in the court who had grown weary of the queen's reach, who had lost children to her purges, who whispered in corridors that she was not wife, but witch. This was the king's silent rebellion. But here lies the tragedy. Every ally he gathered was already being watched. Every whisper he trusted had already been heard. And the queen, knowing he had finally seen the truth, did not rage, did not accuse. She smiled. For she had been waiting for this moment all along. And so the stage was set for the empire's most dangerous game. Husband against wife, king against queen, two thrones locked in a silent war. The people did not see it, not at first. Outwardly, the couple appeared as united as ever. Banquets, ceremonies, processions, they smiled, they touched hands, they played their roles. But behind closed doors the air grew toxic. Words became weapons. Silences became threats. At night, their chambers echoed with unspoken hostility, a marriage bed colder than stone. The king believed he was finally resisting her, building his own secret army of thought. But the queen knew every move, every plan before it was made. Because the covenant that bound them was not just symbolic. It was spiritual. She could feel his rebellion as if it were her own heartbeat. And so she allowed him to play, to conspire, to gather his fragile little circle of resistance. Because when the time came she would crush not just his will, but his very soul. She understood what he did not, that their bond was not a marriage of love, but a chain forged in blood. And blood does not break, it consumes. The breaking point came not with a battle, but with a revelation. During one of his secret investigations, the king descended once more into the crypt beneath the palace. There, in the flickering light of torches, he discovered carvings older than his dynasty, older than the palace itself. They revealed the truth of the covenant. Every royal couple was not husband and wife, but host and parasite. One was chosen to carry the spirit, the other to protect it. The parasite fed on loyalty, on fear, on sacrifice, and in this generation, it was the queen who carried it. She was not merely his wife. She was the vessel of an ancient force, and his role was to shield her, to maintain her power, even at the cost of his own soul. This was the meaning of two thrones, one shadow. He was never meant to rule. He was meant to be ruled. In that moment, despair flooded him. For he realized his rebellion had never been rebellion at all, it was part of the script. Every doubt, every suspicion, every secret plan had been foreseen. The parasite had allowed it, even nourished it, because the struggle itself fed the bond. And when he rose from the crypt, his face was not that of a king, but of a man already broken, already consumed. His throne still stood, but his soul no longer did. The king returned from the crypt hollow-eyed, carrying a secret too heavy for one man. He could no longer look at his queen without seeing the parasite that lived inside her, feeding on him, feeding on the people. Yet outwardly he played his role, draped in gold, smiling at festivals, raising his goblet to cheers. But within he was plotting something desperate. He reached out to the only group he believed untouched by the queen's web, an order of priests sworn to silence, keepers of rituals that predated the covenant. They too had grown wary of the queen's influence. In hidden meetings beneath candlelight, they whispered to the king of forbidden rites, rites that could sever bonds between flesh and spirit. For the first time in years, hope flickered in his chest. But he made a fatal mistake. He trusted too easily. Because one of those priests, cloaked in vows and symbols of purity, had long ago bent his knee to the queen. And before the king's plans could even take shape, she knew every word, every prayer, every desperate hope he carried. Yet she did not stop him. Not yet. For she wanted to watch him crawl into his trap with his own hands. That it was during the winter solstice, under skies so black they seemed to bleed, that the king made his move. He gathered the priests in a subterranean chamber, chanting words forbidden even in whispers. The air thickened. Flames bent against unseen winds. He believed he was calling forth a force to break the covenant, to free himself from her shadow. But the queen had been waiting. When the final chant echoed, the chamber doors flung open and she entered, not with guards, not with soldiers, but alone. Her presence silenced the chants instantly. She did not rage, did not shout. Instead, she walked calmly into the circle, her gown brushing the cold stone, her eyes reflecting the flicker of flame. And in a voice colder than winter, she thanked them. "You have given me what I needed," she said. For their chants, meant to sever the bond, had in fact strengthened it. Every word had been inverted, turned inside out by the doctrine she had mastered. What they thought was freedom was fuel. And in that moment the priests fell to their knees, not in rebellion but in submission. For she was no longer just queen. She was vessel fully awakened, and no man in that chamber doubted it. The king fell silent, realizing too late that his final rebellion had been written into her script from the very beginning. From that night onward, the balance between them was shattered. The king no longer attempted resistance. His face became pale, his voice subdued, his eyes fixed on something far away, as though he lived only as a shadow of himself. But the people began to notice. He no longer addressed them with strength or warmth, only with hollow decrees, his words mechanical, drained of humanity. Rumors spread like wildfire, that the king had been cursed, that he no longer carried his own soul. Some said he was dead already, a puppet propped upon the throne. And in a way they were right. For the parasite had drained him until only his shell remained, while the queen's aura grew stronger, brighter, terrifying in its intensity. To the people, she appeared as a goddess walking among them, untouched by time, untouched by weakness. And here lies the sinister brilliance. The more the king decayed, the more radiant she became. His withering was her ascension. And so the empire began to shift its loyalty, not to the crown as a pair, but to her alone. For the first time the illusion cracked in full daylight, and yet the people accepted it willingly. Because when you worship light, you never question the shadows it casts. But power unchecked always overreaches. The queen's hunger deepened, and soon she no longer cared to hide it. She demanded rituals not just in secret crypts, but in public squares. People were summoned to kneel, not before God, not before king, but before her. In the beginning they obeyed, believing it was symbolic. But as the ceremonies grew darker, blood spilled, chants and forgotten tongues, the illusion began to falter. Fear rippled through the crowds. Parents clutched their children, refusing to let them be taken as offerings. Farmers whispered that the soil itself was turning sour, drained by the rituals. Merchants spoke of shadows that followed them long after leaving the capital. Slowly the adoration began to curdle into dread. And dread, when it hardens, becomes rebellion. Villages stopped sending tribute. Priests began altering sermons, slipping warnings between lines of scripture. And one night, in a tavern thick with smoke, a man raised his mug and declared aloud the phrase that had haunted the empire for generations: 2 thrones, 1 shadow. But this time it was not whispered in fear. It was shouted in defiance. And the people cheered. The rebellion had begun. Rebellion, however, is never as clean as the stories make it. It did not arrive with a single uprising, but in fragments: villages refusing orders, soldiers abandoning posts, priests breaking oaths. The empire, once silent, now echoed with disobedience. And the queen for the first time tasted something new, vulnerability. Yet she did not panic. She turned to the parasite within, and from it came a chilling revelation. Resistance was not a threat, it was nourishment. The fear, the anger, the blood spilled in rebellion only fed her power further. And so she allowed the rebellion to grow, even fanned its flames. For every village burned, every rebel executed, every family torn apart was another feast for the covenant. And in this way rebellion itself became part of the design, an illusion of hope engineered to devour those who dared to fight. But not all rebels were fooled. A small circle realized the truth, that fighting her on the battlefield was suicide. The only way to break her grip was not through war but through belief. They began to spread a new phrase, one that carried no fear, no worship, no hatred. We bleed, but we do not feed. It was a weapon of thought, a fracture in the cycle. And though small, it was enough to spark the next chapter of the empire's fall. The rebellion grew teeth. In the eastern provinces, peasants stormed the granaries and burned the banners of the crown. In the northern hills, hunters who once paid tribute now stalked the queen's envoys like prey, leaving their bodies hanging as warnings. The court whispered of armies rising in the shadows. Yet the strangest development was not the violence, but the king himself. Though hollow, though nearly lifeless, he began to appear in the queen's ceremonies again. His eyes vacant, his body stiff, he moved when she moved, spoke when she willed it. To the crowd, it seemed as though the king's corpse had been bound to her like a marionette. And the rebels, already burning with rage, now saw proof of what they had long feared. Their king was no longer a man but a vessel drained dry. He was not their leader. He was her weapon. The queen unleashed the hollow king as her executioner. In villages suspected of rebellion, it was not soldiers who carried out punishments but the king himself, dressed in his crown and robes, dragging a blade as though half dead, half dreaming. When he raised his sword, the victims did not see cruelty in his eyes, only emptiness. That emptiness was worse than hate. For how do you fight a man who has already been erased? Mothers shielded their children. Fathers cursed his name. Yet even as they spat, a terrible truth festered. The king was not guilty but gone. And that knowledge spread like poison. The rebellion's anger no longer focused only on the queen, it turned inward toward despair. The people asked themselves, if even a king can be hollowed, what chance do we have? The rebellion seemed doomed to collapse under despair, but then came the Ashen Circle, a secret faction of priests, scholars, and fugitives who refused both the queen's shadow and the rebels' blind fury. They understood what others could not. Her power was not sustained by soldiers or palaces, but by belief itself. They began spreading their weapon, a thought more dangerous than any sword. We bleed, but we do not feed. Villagers started carving the words into walls, muttering them under breath as soldiers marched past. Families slaughtered their own livestock in silence rather than allow them to be taken for sacrifice, refusing to let fear become nourishment. The phrase spread like wildfire. It was not rebellion of blade, but rebellion of faith. The queen noticed, and for the first time since her covenant, she felt hunger gnaw at her. Furious, she intensified her rituals. She dragged the hollow king to the palace steps, slicing his arm and letting his blood drip onto the stones, declaring it a gift to the covenant. Yet nothing came. The crowd, staring at their broken king, whispered the forbidden phrase under their breath. We bleed, but we do not feed. The blood fell, but the parasite did not stir. The queen's eyes flashed with rage, then fear. She realized the Ashen Circle had done something worse than rebellion. They had poisoned her feast. Every chant she uttered, every sacrifice she demanded, rang hollow in the air, drained of its power. For the first time, her parasite stirred not in triumph but in hunger unsatisfied. And hunger for creatures like hers quickly became wrath. That night, the palace itself shook. Servants fled screaming as shadows peeled themselves from the walls, clawing at the floor. The parasite inside her, once content to rest in silence, now erupted outward. Its hunger, denied for the first time, tore reality thin. Witnesses spoke of seeing the queen standing in the throne room, her face splitting, not with wounds, but with a second mouth opening along her jawline, whispering in a language no human could hear without madness. The hollow king stood beside her, swaying, his veins blackening as though her hunger was devouring what little remained of him. Outside the palace, the people huddled together, whispering the phrase louder now, turning it into a chant that echoed through the night. We bleed, but we do not feed. The queen screamed, not in pain but in fury at their defiance. And in that scream, the empire finally understood. The covenant was no longer a secret. It was war. The ashen circle knew hesitation would be death. The queen's parasite was no longer content to feed quietly. It would consume the throne, the palace, the land itself if left unchecked. So they moved. In the dead of night, they slipped through tunnels long forgotten, their torches guttering against stone slick with centuries of blood. At their front was a figure cloaked in ash and iron, a woman once sworn to the queen as her handmaiden, now turned traitor. She carried with her a relic older than the empire itself, a blade forged not of steel but of obsidian bound in salt. The circle called it the severer. Its edge was meant not for flesh, but for the unseen bonds that chained spirit to parasite. They had no illusions of victory. Their mission was not to kill the queen, but to cut her covenant at the root, even if it cost them everything. Meanwhile, the city above writhed in chaos. The parasite's hunger bled into the streets. Men woke screaming in languages they never learned, children clawed at their own throats, and animals fled in frantic herds toward the sea. The rebellion, sensing the queen's weakness, stormed the gates. But when they entered the palace grounds, what they faced was not soldiers. It was the shadows themselves. Tall, spindled things dragged across the courtyards, their limbs bending in ways that defied bone. Arrows flew, swords clashed, but each blow only passed through smoke that hissed with laughter. Yet even in the madness, the chant rose louder. The people held each other, repeating it like a weapon. We bleed, but we do not feed. It was fragile, desperate, but each word cut the parasite's grasp thinner. For the first time in centuries, the palace of kings trembled as if its stones themselves rejected the covenant. Inside the throne room, the queen stood barefoot upon the obsidian floor, the hollow king kneeling beside her. His skin had gone nearly translucent, his eyes clouded white, his mouth moving in silent prayer. But he did not pray for salvation, he prayed for release. She placed a hand on his skull, forcing his head toward the ground. From her second mouth, the parasite spoke, each word stretching across the chamber like iron chains. They cannot starve me. You are mine. Yet behind the throne, unseen in shadow, the ashen circle crept closer. The traitor handmaiden gripped the severer, her body trembling. The parasite's voice was so heavy it bent her knees, forcing her to the floor, but she dragged herself forward. Her eyes fixed not on the queen but on the hollow king, for it was through him the covenant first passed, and through him it might be broken. The queen sensed them too late. The severer's obsidian edge flashed in the torchlight as the handmaiden lunged, not at her but at the king. The blade bit not into flesh but into something deeper, invisible. The king's body convulsed, his hollow eyes widening, his mouth tearing open as if releasing years of swallowed screams. The parasite shrieked, its sound splitting glass, its shadows collapsing inward like dying stars. The queen staggered back, clutching her second mouth as it bled black ichor. For a moment, the king's body glowed with a faint, human warmth. His lips moved, not toward the queen, not toward the circle, but toward the people who had once called him father, ruler, protector. He whispered a single phrase, "Forgive me," and then he fell empty but free. The covenant had been severed, but freedom carried its price. Severed from its host, the parasite did not die, it manifested. It erupted from the queen's body, no longer content to hide within flesh. Wings of shadow tore from her back, jaws of black flame split her chest, and a form older than the empire itself crawled into the open. The queen, once its vessel, now dangled like a puppet from its claws, her screams swallowed in its roar. Outside, the people felt the ground quake, their chant trembling against a presence far larger than they imagined. The ashen circle tightened their grip on the severer, knowing the battle was no longer against a queen, but against the hunger that had fed upon their blood for centuries. And though fear rattled their bones, they pressed forward, because the parasite had been unmasked. It could bleed. And if it could bleed, perhaps it could be killed. The parasite's roar shattered the stained glass windows of the throne room, casting shards of colored light across the stone. Each piece reflected a fragment of its form, an endless mouth, a writhing hand, a crown made of bone. It towered above all who remained, and yet, in that horrifying moment, it spoke not with rage but with calm certainty. You thought you were free of kings. You thought you could sever me. But I was never theirs. I was yours. Every secret bargain. Every silent obedience. Every drop of blood you swallowed rather than spill, it was always me. The circle froze. The rebellion faltered. For the parasite was not simply a foreign invader, it was born from the people's own submission. Their fear had given it life. Their silence had given it teeth. And now it fed not on the queen, not on the king, but on the crowd itself. The ashen circle understood the parasite's deception. It wanted them to despair, to fold back into silence, to forget the chant that weakened it. The handmaiden raised the severer high, but its blade no longer glowed. The parasite had shifted hosts. The weapon had power only when the parasite was bound to a single vessel. Now it was everywhere, in every trembling body, every lowered gaze. The rebellion began to splinter, some falling to their knees, whispering the parasite's name like a prayer. But amidst the chaos, one voice cut through. A child's voice. Thin, cracked, but louder than steel. He shouted the chant. We bleed, but we do not feed. Others turned. Others joined. The words rose again, louder this time, until the very stones reverberated with it. The parasite screeched as its shadowed wings faltered. It was not steel that would undo it, it was refusal. Collective, relentless refusal. The queen dangled half dead from the parasite's grip, her face pale, her second mouth torn open and oozing darkness. Yet as she looked down upon the rebellion, she laughed. Not with cruelty but with clarity. Do you see now? She whispered, her voice strangely human. I was never the parasite's master. I was its warning. For years she had fed it, not out of loyalty but out of fear that without her, it would take everything at once. She had bartered her soul, her body, her blood to keep it bound. And now, severed, it had no reason to negotiate. It would consume them whole. The revelation cut deeper than any blade. The queen was both victim and collaborator, savior and traitor. The circle's faith wavered. But the handmaiden, bloodied and trembling, lifted her voice above the queen's confession. Then it dies tonight. Or we do. The parasite thrashed, its form warping into storms of teeth and eyes, but the chant battered it like waves against stone. With every word spoken in defiance, its wings tore wider, its body split deeper. The severer pulsed faintly in the handmaiden's grip. Though the parasite was diffused, its core remained tethered to the queen. With a scream that shredded her throat, the handmaiden leapt, plunging the obsidian blade straight into the queen's heart. There was no blood. Instead, a river of shadows poured upward, coiling, twisting, devouring its host in one final frenzy. The queen's body shattered like glass, scattering into 1,000 fragments of memory. And within the parasite's collapse, a silence fell. For a heartbeat it seemed gone. For a heartbeat, it seemed victory had been won. But silence is never simple. Silence is the parasite's favorite disguise. When dawn rose, the palace lay in ruins. The severer was gone. The ashen circle scattered into myth, their names unrecorded, their bodies unburied. The rebellion staggered from the city, hollow-eyed, whispering the chant under their breath as if afraid to stop. Yet even in ruin, power did not vanish. The throne sat empty, but the halls still reeked of fear, obedience, compromise. And that is where the parasite lives. Not in a queen, not in a king, but in every silence we choose when truth is too dangerous to speak. It was never about thrones or crowns, it was about us. The question that remains is not whether the parasite is dead, but whether you will feed it tomorrow in the small compromises you make, in the truths you bury. If you have followed me into this darkness, type the phrase "we bleed, but we do not feed" twice in the comments below. Let it mark you. Let it remind you. And if you are ready to walk deeper into forbidden knowledge, subscribe now. Because this was not the end. It was the first unveiling.